Welcome out to our fifth installment of the built-in report. And in this installment, we're going to be covering range. And if you're like me, the first time you started Python, you might be looking for something called a for loop. And you might have been really confused for a moment as you realize in Python, everything is a little different, and for is no exception, because in order to get a for loop, we have to use a range object. And of course, range returns an iteration, not to mention an iterable type. So unlike enumerate, range has a total of 3 forms. And the first one, of course, is zero-based. Accessing the help system to take a look at the docstring for range, we see a really healthy documentation of what we can do with range. And we see that range produces an object or instance of the range class that produces a sequence of integers from an inclusive start to an exclusive stop, and with an option of putting in a step. We'll be talking more about the methods defined here later on. So clearing our screen, let's take a look at the first way of using range, or I like to call it type 1 or the default, where range will put together a zero-based range for us to enjoy. Bringing the contents of the ranged object, starting from 5, the first thing to note is that we are going to get a zero-based range from 0 to 4. So while we are actually indeed getting 5 objects, of course, we're seeing the nearly universal way that most modern languages represent, for example, an array or list of objects or tuples by starting our list with 0 rather than 1. Of course, the reason why we start with 0 is easy to understand in machine language, because whenever we put something together and we get a chunk of information back from a function in assembly language or C, we're going to get a pointer to the base of that object. As if we went to the pointer times the size of the object, of course, the first object would be times 0, giving us our original pointer. And the next would, of course, be times 1 or times 2 or times 3 to allow us to increment through a chunk of memory based upon the predetermined size of an object. From C++ to PHP to .NET and Java, let alone our favorite subject today, the zero-based way of looking at things could, for example, help us if we created, for example, a list from my last name. And at the risk of seeing conceited, of course, we could simply loop through a subscript from something that also uses an n+1 so as to fit really nicely with our range definition. In other words, specifying a maximum human enjoyable size, which would be skipped, but still have the same number we need in a zero-based numbering system. Seeing our n to being a simple period, we could turn my name into a nice little acronym, but you get the idea. The zero bases work very nice with built-in concepts such as length, because length, as we all know, returns the human count or number of items in collections, making it fit very nicely when we have a zero-based range to return the same number of items, the terms that computers typically enjoy. So the next idea is having an offset specified. Once again, very similar to what we saw in enumerate for our subscript in range from 1 to 6. Putting our subscript works just as we see to give us a ones-based iteration for 5. Now, if you're new to Python, this might take a little getting used to, but don't worry about it. Practice does make perfect, and as I like to say, programming is a poor spectator sport. So I would very much hope that you're typing along with us, because the next one is simply going to allow us to put our step value in here of 10. Can you guess what this will do? Very simply, of course, we're going to step over from 10 to 60 for every 10th item, which is remotely similar to what we'd do with the modulus operation. Curiously, when we start looking at the range representations, we'll see that when we create an instance of range, we're going to get a class, of course, as we may expect, rather than a type. But when we look for the actual string representation, as we see here, delivered to us by default, we'll see that the interaction of the stir and repr functions allow us to take an otherwise curious-looking class and change it into a representation of what we have defined. In other words, an instance of a range object from 0 to 5. Now, we'll be talking about the differences between stir and RAPR in a later video. And for now, what we really want to do is simply take a look at enumeration like we've seen before when compared against an instance of object to see what is different because we use the minus sign. And if we take a look at that same difference between range and set, we went ahead and broke everything out into a set of lines so that it's easier to follow, noting that we're going to sort RZ before iterating through each one of the sorted items or the differences between the two so as to create the following report. You'll see that we have, interestingly, bool. In other words, we can use it under bool and all of these dunder functions so as to support the related operations, noting that the key commonality is going to be our dunder iter between range and enumerate. We also have some interesting public member functions like index, start, stop, and step, keeping in mind that all index values are 0-based. And more interestingly, if we take a look at the intersection between range and enumerate, we see that we have a lot more in common than we may think. And in order to keep this video under 2 days, I think we'll go ahead and leave this as a homework assignment. If you're curious of anything besides iter and init that we've talked about, or new, set outer, get outer, you can take a look at things like size of or repr, let alone dir, or a subclass hook, as your time and interest may permit. Well, we added a few new questions to our PyQuest card game and flashcard deck. One of the old ones, of course, was KA1028, where we're talking about slicing range. And we'd have to ask ourselves how we would enumerate the odd numbers from our range. Would it be either num, printing the enumeration, 2, printing the contents of our result using slicing, very complicated to understand. You might want to open up your IDE and give that one a try. Will we print range simply as we see here? Would we print another slice without the contents of, or would the answer be more fitting as none of the above as a way to enumerate the odd numbers from a range expression starting at 10 and the final parameter being 16? Something we just covered, of course. If we enter in range 5, what will we see? Will we see the 1, what we typed in, 2, a ones-based enumeration to 6, 3, a ones-based enumeration to 5, 4, the range from 0 to 5, or none of the above? Once again, pretty easy given what we just covered. Another new one might drive you a little nuts unless you take out your IDE and type in each of the possibilities for KA1067, a new question that asks us how we would show every odd number between 1 and 10. Would we either use a print statement with the contents of the range? Could we use every value from a range from 0 to 10? Inclusive and check for every modulus 3, or would we have to use the range with a step value as well as a ones-based? Or could we do number 4? We simply would use range with the ones-based for 10 to 3. Or is the answer 2 of the above? Once again, I wouldn't expect you to be able to get this right off the bat. It takes a good deal of practice. There is no harm in doing the same as it's a review question before choosing your final answer. KA 2030, range versus enumerate. Believe it or not, this is an old question. When we ask, what is a difference between range and enumerate? Is it that range returns 2 values? Or 2 enumerate returns 3 values? Or 3 enumerate has 3 forms or types? Or 4 range offers a step or an increment value? Or 5 none of the above? Well, that wraps it up for our 5th voyage into the built-ins. Short and sweet. I hope you learned something, and I hope you're having fun, because we are very much far from done. And I am, once again, looking forward to seeing you in the professional software development world.